The mid-1980s was the golden age of baseball rookies. And the presence of so many larger-than-life rookies made the rookie card collecting phenomenon grow bigger and bigger.
He may go for two. There he goes. It's going to be close.
Everybody wanted the rookie card of these players who seemed to be destined for the Hall of Fame.
Curveball gets Mumphrey. 2-2 curveball. And the second strikeout.
And so think about this for a second. So you've got a ton of demand for rookie cards for these like incredible Hall of Fame caliber players. You've then got a whole bunch of people buying up tons and tons of packs searching for those rookies. And that leads to the companies printing more cards. This is what led to the junk wax era. And as I've said before, the fact that the print runs of like 1981 or 1983 weren't even close to the insane print runs of say 1988 or 1989 does not mean that the early 1980s were not the junk wax era. Actually, the truth is that there were so many sets printed back then that you probably don't know about most of them to this day. For example, chances are good that you've never heard of this 1982 Darryl Strawberry minor league card, which was printed by TCMA. TCMA also printed a 1983 card for Strawberry. And there was also this famous and pretty ugly black and white card for Dwight Gooden in 1983. TCMA specialized in printing minor league cards like this one and didn't really put much effort into piecing together an interesting card back. At least Gooden had a few stats printed. That's better than nothing. TCMA followed up on a long and mostly forgotten tradition of minor league baseball cards, and the most famous of the old minor league sets was the Z-Nut set, which happens to be one of the most frustrating sets to collect in the long history of baseball card collecting. If you're interested in the history of the old Pacific Coast League, the old Z-Nut cards are pretty interesting. The Z-Nut was like Cracker Jack, but it was on a cob, and this ad comes from a Z-Nut song that was published way back then. Anyway, it's almost impossible to figure out a date for these cards unless you're lucky enough to have one with a coupon on the bottom, such as this Joe DiMaggio card from the San Francisco Seals. Even after decades of research, we don't know too much about these cards. Sadly, most people aren't that interested in collecting cards of minor league players, no matter how good they were. And the fact that the backs were totally blank doesn't help things either. Anyway, these were usually a couple of limited regional minor league sets that were published as time went on. Usually they were published in connection with like some sort of food company or some local business, though not always. For example, this 1961 Cielo Rainier set was apparently sold together with popcorn, though I don't know what brand it was. That same year, the Tacoma Giants had a set printed by the National Bank of Washington. And so here is a real rarity if you're a collector of Gaylord Perry. But you also had cards produced by oil companies, including quite a few by Union Oil. It's frankly amazing to me that Herb Score was still pitching in 1961. But those old minor league sets started to die out with the late 60s and the early 1970s, and that's when a company named TCMA came along. TCMA started off with a kid named Mike Ehrenstein. He was the MA part of TCMA. And the TC part stood for Mike's partner Tom Collier, who I unfortunately couldn't find a picture of. Anyway, these guys met up back in the great days of card collecting, back when you could have a convention in your living room. At some point in time, they decided to form a card selling company and started printing their own magazine and eventually their own cards. Again, I cannot stress enough how early this is. Baseball card collecting was still a small-time hobby back in those days, and people would give you a real funny look if they knew you were collecting as an adult. Plus, of course, Topps had that monopoly on selling cards in the open market with gum, or actually also without gum, but they didn't talk so much about that. This meant that TCMA had to think of some creative ways to come up with a product that it could sell. This 1972 Cedar Rapids Cardinals set was the first TCMA minor league card set. The backs might as well have been non-existent. They're really only useful for giving you the card number, team name, and year. But TCMA also came out with its specialty sets, mostly centered around retired players. And the idea here seems to have been to print nice-looking photo cards for the purpose of collecting autographs. So I've got to say a thank you to the YouTube channel Eric Says for pointing this out to me on Reddit a little while back. I've linked to his channel in the description, so check it out if you have the chance. Now the thing is that TCMA sold these cards almost entirely through mail order. That allowed it to fly under the radar, at least for a while. But of course, Tom and Mike eventually got just a little bit too close to the sun and they wound up getting burned. TCMA's advertising in the early days was limited mostly to issues of the sporting news like this one right here. And of course, the company also had its own publication called Collectors Quarterly for its dedicated customers. Now, in 1975, they got the brilliant idea to create a mail-order only set of Major League Baseball players. They called this set SSPC, which stood for Sports Stars Publishing Company, though it was really just an alternative name for TCMA. Like the old-timer sets, the advantage of the SSPC cards is that they were high-quality photos with nothing else on the front. This was perfect for autograph seekers. In contrast, 1975 Topps cards had facsimile autographs on the front, which made it kind of awkward when you wanted to get the actual autograph. These SSPC cards are absolutely iconic and are arguably one of the nicest looking baseball card sets of all time, even though Reggie Jackson's not looking at the camera. And I'm guessing most of you are not familiar with some of the more creative cards in this set. But one look at the back makes it clear that this was 100% TCMA. Honestly, that SSPC set reminds me a lot of 1953 Bowman Color, one of the best sets of all time. And I'm pretty sure that Tom and Mike intended for this set to give off that feeling. That 1953 Bowman Color set was famous because of how clean and high quality the fronts were. I'm honestly surprised that more companies don't go for this style. It's timeless, it's classic, it looks great. Those SSPC cards fit right in, and the similarities are absolutely obvious. And it's kind of a shame that these cards are not better known. You can still get a full set of these babies for under $300, which I think is a steal given how nice these cards are. But the problem that people have with this set is that it was never sold in packs. TCMA wanted to avoid the wrath of Topps, and so it sold the sets in mail order only. And for decades, the gatekeepers of the hobby have decided that these cards were somehow illegitimate because of that. It's the same problem that the Star basketball cards had for years. If you wanted this set, you had to answer one of these ads, and yes, this set was printed in much smaller quantities than the overhyped 1976 Topps set. In the end, however, Topps sued TCMA for $2.5 million. I was only able to find bits and pieces about the lawsuit from other newspaper articles, and all I know is that there was a settlement somewhere. And actually, it's a lot easier to find articles about Mike Ehrenstein, the card collector, than Mike Ehrenstein, the card producer. Anyway, so why bring all of this up here in this video about 1983? Well, this is pretty simple. The thing is that by 1983, TCMA was flooding the market with unusual types of cards, and TCMA's example inspired a bunch of other companies to do the same thing. Unfortunately, most collectors don't know or care that there's a black and white 1980 minor league card for Ryne Sandberg. This 1981 Oklahoma City 89ers card looks a little bit better, but then again, most collectors don't pay much attention to stuff like this. Instead, Rhino's 1983 Topps card wound up being his iconic rookie card. This is the card that kids dreamed about getting for years. But that didn't stop TCMA from making dozens and dozens of minor league card sets. My understanding is that TCMA would meet with the front offices of these minor league teams and make a pretty simple deal. So you give us your promotional photos and we'll make a card set for you. You can give the cards away, you can sell them, you can do whatever it is you want with your share, and we'll make money by selling the rest through our catalog. And they did this for minor league teams at all levels throughout all of North America. And then you had TCMA coming out with fictional sets that never actually existed, like this 1942 Play Ball set. I think these sets were made in part to give collectors something to fill in the missing years of baseball card history. After all, there were no card sets during the war because of military needs. But these cards also gave autograph hunters something relatively cheap to use to secure those precious old-timer autographs. And some of these sets were pretty nice, such as this set for the 1933 All-Star Game. This set was done in connection with Renata Galasso Incorporated, and this is another can of worms to open. Renata Galasso was known chiefly for reprinting classic old baseball card sets. I guess that this was seen at the time as sort of a kind of legitimate alternative to paying the big bucks to get the original cards. Now, my understanding is that these reprinted sets were also sold through TCMA, so you see how this works together, and they can cause a lot of confusion for collectors. So, for example, this T206 set was reprinted by Renata Galasso also in 1983. If you look really closely at the bottom, you can tell that these are reprints. It says capital reprint right down here. And then you've got this 1933 Gaudi reprinted set, also put out by Renata Galasso in 1983. Here, the reprint notice comes between Gaudi Gum Company and Boston on the back. And of course, they reprinted the most famous card of all from that set. But notice that they forgot to put the reprint text on the back of that card. And then you've got this reprinted 1915 Cracker Jack set, which also came out in 1983. I don't believe any of these cards have the reprint text on the back, which makes it even more controversial. So if you're collecting vintage cards, you have to be really careful about things like this, and this is one of the reasons why grading cards has become such a big thing as the years have gone on. Reprinting cards like this was very, very common in the 1980s. Now there are ways to test to determine if the cards are legitimate or not, but it's not always that easy, and you honestly have to become familiar with every single possible reprinted set like that exists in the world. This honestly was a type of junk wax. This is reprint junk wax, since most people aren't really all that interested in reprinted cards to begin with. And the interesting thing is that even Topps got into this act in 1983. Topps decided to reprint its 1952 Topps set in 1983. That's one of the most famous sets of all time. And there was actually quite a bit of skepticism about this set. For one thing, the set was not going to be complete since 5 players refused to give permission for Topps to reprint their cards. For another, collectors were extremely skeptical that this set would actually be a limited edition set after their experience with 1982 Kmart. So there's a reason why I kept talking about the Kmart set in the 1982 video, right? I know that a lot of you folks don't totally believe me on this, but that was an absolute junk set. Do not buy it. There's so much of it out there you do not know. And unfortunately, the 1983 version of 1952 Topps also wound up being pretty junky. The controversy here is that you could only get the set in a complete box. You could not get it in individual packs. So this took all of the fun out of collecting since you could not buy packs looking for some specific card. The other problem is that most collectors kept their factory boxes sealed, which means that there's not really that much of a premium for a sealed set. Topps blasted these advertisements all over the place. And this set was limited to 40,000 copies, which doesn't seem all that limited to me. On the bright side, it only cost $40 to get the whole set. These days, a complete set will cost you a little bit over $200, maybe a little bit more if you wanted a sealed box, but not really that much more. And the biggest complaint that collectors had then and now is that the cards just do not look that good. The quality is not that great. So it took decades for Topps to figure out that the secret was to make cards in the old style for today's players. And it's seriously crazy to me that it took this long for these companies to figure out something that was so simple and obvious. Topps heritage really should have been a thing back in the 1980s. I mean, it seems like an obvious move to make, doesn't it? Anyway, the nice thing is that the official 1983 Topps set was actually a really attractive set. In fact, this is one of the best Topps sets ever. Topps really did well with the design of its 1983 set. Combining 2 photos together was an excellent design choice. And the backs were okay, though they were still kind of bland compared to those iconic backs of the 1950s. Seriously though, the card fronts look just awesome. The display boxes also look nice and colorful. The packs unfortunately look the same as every other Topps set from the 1980s. For years, this Tony Gwynn rookie was one of the most iconic rookie cards of its time. And the same is true of this 1983 Topps Ryne Sandberg. Topps also did a few collector's edition sets, well, like limited collector's edition sets, which were not really that limited. They were a little more limited than the official set, though there are still way too many of these cards out there. This All-Star set looks a lot like the 1976 SSPC set, for instance. And it's okay, I guess, though there really isn't much demand for it. You could also mail in to get one of these league leader panels, but the back was blank, which really sucks. And then of course you had the Topps Traded set, which was only available as a complete box. That's where you've got the Strawberry rookie, which was a pretty iconic card. Well, it's relatively iconic. You see, Topps was still making this major mistake by waiting until the traded set before printing cards of the big rookies. And Topps continued to make this mistake for the entire decade of the 1980s. It really is a shame. The All-Star Game program in 1983 also had a set of Topps cards if you didn't mind the really small size. These cards are pretty bland overall. And since they're tiny, there just isn't much room for any information on the back. Anyway, the fact that every conceivable product had its own baseball card line by 1983 should tell you that we were indeed smack in the middle of the junk wax era once again. And that brings us to Donruss, which did a classic junk wax move in 1983. They didn't change their card design at all. Now, nobody's going to claim that the 1982 Donruss set was a classic. I think it's a fine looking set, but it's not one of those sets that you'll always remember. It's kind of bland. 1983's Donruss used the same design, except that the glove was on the other side of the card, and the backs somehow were even worse. Like, I don't get it. They didn't change anything? Like, what kind of corporate decision was that? You've got Topps making all-star cards that look just like 1976 SSPC, and then Donruss decides to do the same thing 2 years in a row. It just blows my mind. Anyway, the one Donruss insert in 1983 was the Ty Cobb puzzle. As usual, the first dozen cards or so were Diamond Kings. The artwork here is okay, though I feel like this really was a drop off from the year before. And like, maybe that's just me, I don't know. I know that a lot of you wrote in the comments that you don't care for those Diamond King cards. I like them. I do know, however, that 1983 was a really sloppy year for the Diamond Kings. In fact, I have a feeling that modern AI slop would make cards that look a lot better than the art on those cards. For example, Donruss also came out with this Hall of Fame Baseball Greats set in 1983. Instead of making this an insert set, Donruss decided to make it a separate set for some really stupid reason. Anyway, all of these cards are art cards and they look like garbage. And there aren't even any stats on the back. I'm serious when I say that AI slop looks better than this Ted Williams card. The players all look like their heads have been like dented in by something. This is just a terrible set, and honestly, I expected a lot more from this company. So I guess 1983 was like the year of printing cards for old retired guys. Well, that plus making, really badly designed cards. I will end my Donruss rant with this Action All-Stars card set. These are oversized cards that look nicer than the base set, but just barely. The problem is that the action photo is small and the posed photo is big. It's just an ugly looking set all in all, and it's a pretty generic 1980s junk set. And of course, these were sold in their own packs and with a completely different puzzle as well. Now, it took years for them to realize that they could stick, insert sets into the base set. So just like that Topps Heritage thing I was just talking about, this idea is not something that should be that difficult to think of. Like, I'm not sure who was running the strategy of these companies, but they clearly did not know what they were doing. They didn't know what collectors were interested in. Anyway, let's move on to Fleer. After 2 years of awful quality cards, Fleer came out with a winner in 1983. The backs were lame, but the fronts were great. 1983 Fleer is a cost-effective alternative to Topps, and the cards do look pretty nice. And the fronts really are attractive, even though there's that thick border. So the key to the success of 1983 Fleer is that the company actually took its time to make this set, which means that it had far fewer errors than the first two Fleer sets had. And they did a whole bunch of really cool things as well, most of which people have forgotten about. So you have special cards like Ozzie Smith together with Lonnie Smith, though the two weren't actually related. You had Dave Winfield posing together with Kent Herbeck. And then you had these half and half cards. You had Bud Black on this side, and then you had Vida Blue on this side, black and blue. So that's a gimmick, I know, but it's a pretty cool gimmick, and it was a lot more creative than anything that Topps was doing at the time. Fleer did a really good job with its 1983 set, even though it still is junk wax. You can get a complete 1983 Fleer set for around $100 or so. A Donruss set will cost you about the same, though you have to remember that Donruss sold factory sealed and packaged complete sets directly to collectors. And a Topps set will cost you a little bit more depending upon the condition of the big money cards. Now, in the end, whether it's like a good deal or whether it's a bad deal kind of depends on you. It depends upon how much you value the product. Now, like I said, I really like the 1983 Topps set, especially with all of those nice looking rookie cards of Hall of Fame players. The design is phenomenal. But the thing is that the Fleer set is also nice and it's quite a bit cheaper. And you should always check out those TCMA cards if you want something that's just a little bit different. Speaking of which, if you really want to see something different, just wait until next time when we get to 1984 Fleer. So I'll talk to you then.